Hi, I'm Jim McCarthy from BeginDrumming.com. Now, one of the things that's really common with beginner drummers is that they get a new drum kit and they're not quite sure how to set it up. Or even if you've been playing drums for a while, there might be a few things that you haven't come across yet that can really help you with your drum setup to A, get around the drums a little bit better, and B, maybe avoid some of those problems in performance situations. So, without further ado, let's go into how to set up the drum kit. Okay, so we're going to start right here in the corner of this room, which is where we're going to set up the drum kit. And it's a fairly common place to set up a drum kit, fair enough, it's tucked out of the way. What we're going to do is we're going to set it up facing the back wall. We're going to imagine that the back wall there is actually the audience, as if we're on stage. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to grab the bass drum, start with the bass drum first, and the mistake that most people make is that they get the bass drum and pretty much face it into the wall or directly out to the audience. Now, that's okay in the practice room, of course, because it doesn't really matter exactly which way you're facing. It's whatever fits nicely in your room. But really, if that's the audience back there, what you want to do is face the bass drum actually a little bit to the right, like so. So that's straight on. We're going to face it a little bit to the right, even about 45 degrees. That's because when you're sitting at the drum kit, your body faces a little bit to the left of the bass drum. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get it so that when the drummer is sitting down naturally at the drum kit, he's facing the audience. So I'll just adjust the camera here for a minute and you'll see the bass drum at this kind of almost 45-degree angle. So there you have it. There's the bass drum at a 45-degree angle. Okay, so the next thing we're going to have a look at is the spikes on the side of the bass drum. Okay, let's get in close. Okay, so we're looking here at the spike on the bass drum, and I'm just going to lift it up so you can see in nice and close. Usually what you'll see on the end of the bass drum is this adjustable spike, and you'll see that there's this little screw on the end. Now, because we're on carpet, we're just going to leave the pointy spike going into the carpet. If we were on a hardwood floor or a vinyl floor or a concrete floor, we'd have a rubber tip which screws onto the top there, and then you'd get this screw and screw that down hard against the rubber tip so that steel spike wasn't going into the steel floor and into the wooden floor and ruining it, and you'd find that the rubber would actually grip better as well. With just the metal spike, we're going to screw the screw all the way up to the top. If we don't do that, we'll gradually find that it starts to rattle around and make noise. Okay, so let's have a look now at the angle of the spike. This is the direction facing out towards the audience. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to have that not straight, not facing this way, but the spike facing slightly outwards towards the audience. That's so that when I'm playing the bass drum and my foot's going to be playing in from this side here, okay, and bass drum wants to kind of move away every time I hit it. I'm hitting it and it's sliding away. You can see that there. That's what the pedal's going to be doing. So if I angle it just one or two steps further away from the sitting position of the drummer out towards the audience, that spike will dig in and provide a little bit more resistance to the bass drum sliding that way. Okay, and you'll notice that I've adjusted the spike here so that it pretty much spikes into the carpet quite nicely at about the same time that the bottom edge of the drum actually sits on the ground. So all three bits, the spike on this side, the spike on the other side, and the edge of the bass drum will just sit along the ground, and those spikes are digging in nicely. Okay, so you're going to adjust that here so that the height of the spike is okay. You might actually even adjust that a little bit higher so the back of the drum comes slightly off the ground. Some people prefer that, but in the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so that's the spikes on the bass drum. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to put the tom arms, the arms that are going to hold the tom-toms here on top of the bass drum, inside here. Some tom arms, it doesn't really matter how you do it, but depending on the design of yours, it may do. Have a look at this. These ones here are kind of old-fashioned pearls, and you'll see that, that they've got an adjustment knob on that side, and if you've got the correct pair for these, you'll find that they're actually on different sides. So if I hold them out matching like that, one will be going that way and one will be going that way. So which way around you put which one on the bass drum actually matters. if I was to do this, okay, putting my toms like that, what you'll see now is that these two adjustment screws are facing right in towards each other. Because I don't want them like so, I want them facing a little bit more towards the player, that's where you're looking from right now, then these two things are going to be right next to each other, and it's going to be very hard to adjust them. So what I want to do is take them out, swap them over, and now when I put them in, and I'm just going to put them in, these ones are fairly short, so I'm not going to put them in very far, I'm going to leave them as high as I possibly can, adjust them here, screw them up, and here we have it, the screws on the back now, so I can adjust them quite easily without the toms getting in the way, without them touching in the middle here. Okay, so that's a pretty important aspect of that. You'll also notice the angle of the tom arms is about 90 degrees. Okay, what we don't really want to do is we don't really want to have the angle so that it's kind of facing up like that and the tom arm right down the bottom like that. That's not really any good. You want it probably fairly high. Once again, these are pretty short tom arms, so I want them pretty much as high as possible. And the angle of them should be such that if anything slightly facing downwards past 90 degrees or about 90 degrees, that's going to give you a good angle at the of the tom at the top. If we have it like this, okay, and too low, that means the tom-tom is kind of going to face that way, and these two toms are going to face in towards each other, and that's not really good. So we want the tom-toms to be relatively flat, so we have this kind of 90 degree angle. Okay, so let's put the toms on. Which one are we going to start with? Well, we're going to start with the biggest one, okay? We want the toms to be pretty low down to the drum without really touching and sitting on top of the bass drum. So the lower we get them, the better. That means, though, we need to start with a bigger one, because the bigger one can't actually get as low, because it's deeper. So let's start with the biggest one. Okay, so here's the deep tom-tom, and I'm just going to slide it on like so. Now there's really no point having it out here at the end of the tom arm. You really want it to be as far in as you can, okay? So it's right in as tightly as it can, not sort of out here, but right in like so against there. And you'll notice that the bottom of the drum now is actually pretty close. Once again, these tom arms are fairly short. Okay, and I'm going to adjust this later, but as long as I've got clearance here, that's all right. I'll just put that around like this so I can get a better look at it, and you can get a look from the side. Okay, so that's kind of flat. What I want is this bottom corner here, and once again I'm in the position of the drummer, I want the bottom corner to kind of sit down, almost touching but not quite the bass drum there. Once I've done that, I've angled that drum slightly in towards me, and you'll notice that the drum, because I've got a 90 degree bend, it isn't facing inwards towards the other tom-tom. It's basically facing almost straight out. Okay, let's show you that from the front on perspective there. Okay, so it's not facing inwards like it would be, and I'll just show you, if I had the tom arm like that, it would tend to, the two tom-toms would tend to face in towards each other like that. Instead, it's just past 90 degrees, or at about 90 degrees, so the two toms are going to have pretty much the same angle of attack. Let's get the other tom-tom in here. Okay, so once we've got the big tom on, we can get the smaller one on, roughly the same angle, maybe about a bit flatter, and then once I've got that one on, I can actually adjust the height of it so that it's about at the same height as the bigger one. Remember, the bigger one can't go quite as low. So that's about the same height, and I'll kind of adjust them so they're both flat. I'll get a bit more precise with that once I've got some of the other drums in place. But basically they're about as low as they can go now, and essentially at the right angle, so that's the most important thing. Alrighty, now I'm going to get the angle of this drum back to the 45 degrees. There it is. The next important step is the bass drum pedal. So you'll notice that on the bass drum pedal we have this little spring here on the side. Now the spring is something that we can adjust to adjust the tension. If we have a tight spring, that's going to pull that beater back really sharply. If you have a loose spring, it's going to be pushed down by our foot and not tend to recoil as fast. I tend to have the spring pretty tight, and there's all sorts of other adjustments you can do there, but basically by tightening or loosening this little knob at the bottom of the spring, that's how you adjust the tension on that to get the beater either springing back hard or having it looser. And then there's a little knob underneath the pedal, okay? So if there's the pedal, we're looking at it from the side, there's a little screw here. And that's what you screw the pedal actually onto the lip of the bass drum with. So undo it a little bit, and then you'll see this little clamp has to go over the bottom rim of the bass drum. So I'll slide that in here. Now, sometimes you might find that when I try and tighten this up, it doesn't go all the way and it's still a little bit loose. This one's okay actually, so I can just tighten up that screw until it's fairly firm, and then you'll find the bass drum pedal stays on quite nicely. Okay, you see I can hit that and it's not sliding around. If it doesn't tighten on properly, you might get a little rubber pad to sit underneath that clamp and fill up the gap a little bit more. It also protects your rim. One thing that is worth noting about the position of the bass drum screw, when you do it up, there's a fair bit of adjustment. What you really want is you really want that screw to be in that position. Okay, can you see it in there? It's pretty tough to see. But what you don't want is you don't want that screw to be like that, because then this bit tends to hit the pedal because it's sticking out a little bit. You want the screw to be like that. Not like that, but like that. So it's kind of horizontal. Alright, you can see it in there. It's horizontal, and that's going to mean that when you push the pedal down, it doesn't touch that thing and get a bit of a click sound as the bottom of the pedal hits the metal. There we go. So there's your bass drum pedal ready to go. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get the stool in position. Here's my drum stool. Basically it's got to be back here, and we want it slightly, from my perspective as the drummer, I want the bass drum to be slightly on my right, because that's where my right foot's going to go, on that pedal. So this is kind of what it should look like, and you'll notice that I'm basically adjusting the position of the stool so that as I sit normally like this, my legs at about 90 degrees, and if I'm sitting comfortably on the stool, my legs should be pointing straight into the drum, my foot should sit naturally on the pedal, and my other leg's kind of out to the other side. But that's a really natural position. The distance of the stool is such that my leg is just pointing in towards the drum, and it's about 90 degrees bend. Okay, so our next job is to get the snare drum in position. First of all, let's have a little look at the snare drum. Okay, so here's my snare drum stand. You'll notice at the base here, I've got these, I've adjusted this, so I don't want it up there, or I don't really want it all the way out either. I want that tripod to be at about 45 degrees. There it is, 45-degree tripod. And here's a height adjustment, and this claw is what actually grips onto the snare drum. So there's a little screw here, and I've undone that a fair way so that this claw is wide enough for me to put the snare drum in. Now, as I put it in, I need to make sure of a few things. I need to make sure that all of these 3 points around here, that one here, doesn't really clamp up against any one of these lugs here. Even more important is to make sure that it doesn't interfere with the snare lever here, or the other side of the snare where the tape is being held right there. If it interferes with that, we're going to be in trouble. The claw is actually going to prevent us from adjusting that snare later. So we want all of these things, all of these little rubber clamp corners, to not really be touching anything but the rim of the drum. Once we've done that, we're going to tighten up this screw here. Okay, and we're going to do that until those claws come right in and hold the drum fairly firmly. Some people think that you're going to get a better sound if you don't have it too tight, have it just sitting fairly loose so it doesn't sort of clamp onto the bottom rim and let it ring a bit more freely, and that's probably a fair point. I don't worry too much, just get it so that you can't really pull the drum off the stand. That's all kind of one unit now, okay? So now I'm going to get the snare drum and put it in position. One other thing I'd like to just go through quickly on the snare drum is that you'll notice there's a lever on the side which adjusts the snare. Okay, here it is. There's a couple of different sorts of lever. This one is the sort that pulls away like that. When I push in, that brings the snares on. When I pull it away like that, that takes the snares off. There's also a little screw here. There it is. And if I turn that clockwise, it tightens up the snares so they're a bit more snug against the bottom skin. If I loosen it, it lets them come away. I want to adjust that screw so that basically the snares are up fairly snug when the lever's on, and also make sure that when I turn the lever off, that screw is loose enough that the snares aren't actually still touching the bottom skin and creating a sound. So we get a complete full snares off sound, but when I put the lever on, okay, I get a relatively decent sound. Okay, so now that we've got the snare drum, we're going to put it in position. Notice that I'm getting it such that the angle of the drum is probably just a little bit pointing towards the drummer. Here's the drummer right here. The drummer is pointing slightly towards us. Not too much though, we don't want that sort of angle, okay, a really steep angle of the snare drum. We don't really want it perfectly flat either, but just a tiny, tiny bit of angle. Not too much, just a tiny bit of angle. One other thing that we'll go through with the snare drum is the position of the legs. We'll get the camera in and get a closer look. Okay, so let's have a look at the legs position here. This leg is kind of on an angle about 45 degrees pointing away from the bass drum, and that's because our next job is to put the hi-hat in position. Now, if you're playing a show and the hi-hat's a bit like the bass drum, it tends to slide away from you. So one little trick we can do is to make sure the one leg of the hi-hat sits behind the leg of the snare drum, and that'll tend to help keep it in place. If you put it on this side of the leg, on the back edge, that hi-hat has the ability to keep sliding further and further away. But if we make sure that leg is on this side, it won't be able to slide so far away from you. So let's get that in position now. Here it is, hi-hat on that side. We don't want it on that side. Okay, so that side. And we want that pedal to be facing kind of towards the stool as well, which we'll get back into position in a minute. The next job is to actually sit down and to get some fine adjustment on the position of those pedals so that as we sit, the legs are facing naturally. Okay, so here we have it. We've got our legs now so that we're pointing pretty much directly into the bass drum, and the other leg is pointing directly out towards the hi-hat there. And let's have a look at the height of the hi-hat. There's two things you can adjust on the hi-hat. This knob here adjusts the height of the top cymbal. I'll take that off for a minute. There's another knob down here, you can see that, and with that I can adjust the height of the whole cymbal. This would be probably a little bit too low. It's right down next to the height of the snare drum. I don't want that too low because if I do that, the other hand can't get underneath it. Okay, but I don't want it right up here either because then there's a long way to travel up there. So I'd like to think about a hand's height, the bottom cymbal above the snare drum, maybe a little bit less, maybe just by knuckles. Depends on your sort of action that you use. So there's the height of the bottom cymbal. Pop the top cymbal on top. Okay, and we want the, I'll push my foot down on the pedal till this is pretty much as far down as it can go. Don't screw it up then. What we want to do is we want to just let that foot come up at least a fraction and then tighten it. That way you can get a pretty good gap here with the cymbals, but when you put your foot down you can get them really tight. Okay, that's really important. There's also under here, and I'll get this in a bit closer so you can see, okay, right there, there's a little screw. What this screw does is adjust the angle of the bottom cymbal. I don't want that to be perfectly flat. I want to tilt that washer just a fraction, get it in even closer, angle that bottom cymbal a bit so that when the cymbals close, one end, or one side, closes slightly before the other, and we don't get an airlock between the two cymbals. Okay, that makes a much nicer splashy sound when they close as well. Okay, so with all of that in position, what I'm going to do now is just adjust the angle of these tom-toms and get them so that they're really comfortable for me. I'm going to angle them in so that if I had a pair of sticks, they were sort of just a nice gap. You'll see here's my snare drum just here. There's really very little gap now between the snare drum and the tom-tom. That's great because when I'm trying to move my stick quickly up to the tom-tom like this, I'm not going to get the tip of the stick caught underneath here, and then I'm going to lose it, it's going to go flying off. So you want the tom-tom fairly low to the snare drum, but without having the snare drum so high that you have to kind of lift your arm up to play it. Notice that if I just hold my arms loosely by my sides, sort of a 90-degree bend, they're just sitting above the height of the snare drum, so it's very easy for me to play the drum. The drum's low enough that I can still hit the rim if I want to, but not so high that I'm always going to hit the rim. It's easy for me to clear the rim, okay? And my hands can quite easily get to these tom-toms, they're all just facing me. You'll also notice that I'm actually facing that wall, or the audience now. If I was facing the way the bass drum is, I'm going to be facing that way, towards the corner. But I don't want to do that. I've got the snare drum directly in front of me between my two knees, and I'm now facing the wall. That's why we have the bass drum on the angle. Our next job is to put the floor tom in position. So let's do that. Okay, so let's get the floor tom in position. Here's the floor tom. You notice on this floor tom, the legs have this little angle at the bottom, so the base of the legs should be wider than the actual drum. What I don't want is I don't want that to be kind of adjusted like this, so it's on the side. I want it to be facing away from the drum. Now the height of those legs is also pretty important. First of all, let's just get them basically in position. We want the height of the drum to be pretty much the same as the snare drum, or maybe just a little bit higher, and we want it to angle slightly towards the drummer, much the same as the mirror image of the snare drum. So there it is, maybe just a little bit higher. You'll notice also there's not much gap there. Same things we had on the snare drum here, not much gap. And there's enough room for the knee to slide comfortably in between the snare drum and the floor tom there. Let's have a look at that. So here it is from a different perspective. You see my knee pointing in towards the drum, and there's plenty of gap in here. I can get my hands down between the two, but it's pretty much close, so my hands can get to each drum without too much movement, okay? Plenty of room. Now, at this point, if you use a music stand, the best place to put it is exactly where you want to be looking in a performance, i.e. at the audience. That means when you're practicing, or even when you're performing and you've got music in front of you, you're basically reading your music, but you're still connecting with the audience. So there's a nice gap here between the hi-hat and the tom, and in that gap, that's where I'm going to put my music stand. Okay. Not a great high quality music stand here, but now I've got that music stand pretty much facing in the gap between the tom-tom and the hi-hat here. Now, if I was actually playing in a live show here, I'd probably have that music stand down pretty much as low as I could, so I can still connect over the top of the music with the audience. You may have to adjust that if you're actually following a conductor or something like that, so that your eye line looks at the music, you can still see the conductor directly behind it. Otherwise it's too far away from your peripheral vision. But if you're just reading, or if you're doing a show, live show, have it down nice and low so I can look over the top at the audience. Now the next thing is to put all the cymbals in position. Now cymbals of course are very, very varied. People have all sorts of different combinations of cymbals and so forth. So there's no real hard and fast rules about cymbals. One thing I will say is whatever cymbals you do put in there, it's really best to sort of try and keep them relatively low. In catalogues, you'll see photos of drum kits with the cymbals up really high, and it looks fantastic. It makes drum kits look bigger and shinier and all the rest of it. But in practice, all that means is every time you play a cymbal note, you're going to be late getting to the cymbal because you're trying to get your hand all the way up here, and that's really tough to do. So get your cymbals down nice and low to the drums without being silly about it. Okay, you don't want them to be so low that when you hit the cymbal, it actually rocks down and contacts with the rim. Let's have a look at how I have mine. First of all, I get a ride cymbal, and that's usually out on the right hand side of the drum kit next to the floor tom. Some people have it kind of quite high and sort of angling in quite a bit. I tend to have mine a bit further around the side, and basically I want to get it over the top of the floor tom, quite low down. I tend to have mine fairly flat. Oop, there we go, hang on, I'll just tighten it up. Bit higher than that. If I had it too low, every time I hit it, it would hit the floor tom like that. We don't want that. So I have it high enough so that in normal playing, it won't rock down and hit the floor tom. And once again, just angling in towards the body of the drummer, so that when I have my arm just sitting loosely by my sides, it's going to go directly in towards the right cymbal. There we are. I've got my elbow just by my sides, and I can point to there without having to kind of put it in any weird positions. It's right easy. I don't have to hold my hand up in the air. It's just going to give me a really sore shoulder if I'm playing that ride cymbal all night long. Okay, and it's slightly in front of me too. I don't want it so far around here to the side. It's basically there in a comfortable position for my right hand. Okay, and I've cheated a bit, and I've just bunged these other cymbals in. These ones are on a big rack for me, but you could just put these on a stand. I've got a couple of other cymbals here. You'll notice they're kind of within very easy reach. They're quite low to the tom, they're not right up here, but actually these could even be a little bit lower, but they're high enough that when I'm playing the tom-tom, I'm not likely to hit the cymbal on the way up. And look at the angle of the cymbal too. The angle of the cymbal is really important. I don't want it like that, because then I can't really get over the edge of the cymbal. Okay, I want to be able to play on top, but also I want to be able to play over the edge too, so I don't want the cymbal to be kind of too flat like this, so that every time I hit it I'm playing sort of into the edge of the cymbal. I want it to be such that I can just play a glancing blow over the edge of the cymbal like that. Once again, not too far away too. Notice, you know, I can touch that with my hand without my elbow being too far away from the body. So that's a really good position for the cymbal. So I really hope you've got something out of this little guide to setting up the drum kit. Now you've got your drum kit set up in a relatively comfortable position, you can start learning how to play. Don't forget that the Begin Drumming system is perfect for those of you who are just starting out with your drum kit. You can check it out at www.begindrumming.com.